Great, so you ready?
Yeah.
Right, so heads up.
Bonjour, merci. Je suis tellement heureuse et fière d'être ici avec mes collègues députés de Kitchener-Centre, Mike Morrice, et mon chef adjoint et vraiment mon partenaire, co-leader, Jonathan Pedneault, pour le Parti vert du Canada, moi-même, Elizabeth May. Je suis tellement nous sommes fiers de présenter les priorités du Parti vert du Canada, que nous avons envoyé une lettre de priorité à Mme Freeland, le Premier ministre adjoint et ministre des Finances, en mois de février. So we're pleased now to share with everyone what we sent to Chrystia Freeland February 9th as our pre-budget submission with the priorities that we want to see in this year's budget. They break down into a number of categories. Mike Morrice is also, as well as being the Member of Parliament for Kitchener Centre, the Green Party housing critic. Nous avons en priorité sur la question de logement social. And we are very, very committed, and we hope to see in this budget, which should have been there long before, the Canada Disability Benefit. And we want to see real action around climate, particularly in building out our national infrastructure capacity with a national electricity grid. I'm going to turn first to Jonathan Pedneault for his comments on our priorities, and then to Mike Morrice. Jonathan.
Merci, Elizabeth. Thank you. Good to see everyone. This is a budget about priorities for the coming many years. It's an incredibly important budget for Canadians at a time when Canadians are really struggling. Canadians of all walks of life are suffering from policy choices that have been made by Liberal and Conservative governments alike for the past many decades. And so we're hoping to see a strong shift in the approach that this government is using or known to use, which is a lot of talk but very little action. One very good example of that, and we've had a wonderful study from Corporate Knights that was published recently that shows that climate commitments, the funds that had been committed to being spent by the federal government to address the climate emergency were short by 30% since 2015. That's $14 billion that should have been spent but weren't. And instead, as we recently also saw from an environmental defense study, we've had $18.6 billion that have been committed to climate offensive businesses like the big oil and gas companies in this country that have been raking gigantic profits for the past, since the pandemic, have been gouging Canadians at the gas pump. And so we're hoping to see a shift here in how government not only grows its revenues but spends them. We're seeing the inklings of nice announcements by the government, including on the Canada the School Food Program, which is a wonderful initiative. Sadly, it falls far below what is actually needed. We're talking about $1 billion that have been announced over 4 years. That's $200 million for 400,000 children. If you look at 190 days of school, that's $2.6 per children. Now, let's look at an alternative scenario. Let's use $18.6 billion that have been spent on oil and gas, and let's give it instead to children over 190 days. That would be $20 per kid per school throughout Canada for the 4.9 million children that are in this country instead of 400,000 like this government is looking at, which is less than 10% of the overall number of children in school in this country. So it's all about priorities, and what we've seen for the past many decades is governments prioritizing the interests of big corporations, big businesses at the expense of average Canadians. We've seen between 2009 and 2021 that the margin of profits for companies in this country has increased by 42%. Meanwhile, your salary only increased by 24%. So where's the rest of that money? Where's this increase that is so badly needed for Canadians? Because we're seeing Canadians getting more and more into debt. Last year, Canadians spent $1.9 trillion collectively, but the revenues, their employment revenues were only of $1.7 trillion. So that's $200 billion that had to either be loaned or taken from money that was saved in various accounts by Canadians over many years. So we're seeing Canadians are struggling, and we'd love to see this government finally decide to go and get the money where it actually is. And we know that there's a lot of money in this country, and tax it and redistribute it through solid programs that will help us face the climate emergency and the increasing crisis of inequality that we're seeing in this country. Just as a quick reminder, between 2009 and 2021, big companies increased their assets from 14 trillion to 28 trillion. They doubled it, and none of this is taxed. If you were only to tax that at 0.5%, every year, you'd be raising $140 billion in additional revenues. Think about everything you could do with that. So we're hoping to see some thinking outside the box from our liberal friends. Très brièvement en français, c'est un budget de priorité, c'est un budget important. Les Canadiens ont de la misère à se loger, ont de la misère à se nourrir. On sait qu'il y a énormément d'argent dans ce pays. Les profits, les marges de profit des corporations canadiennes, ils ont augmenté de 42% en 2009 puis 2021. Puis pendant ce temps-là, les salaires, ils ont augmenté seulement de 24%. Il est où le reste de l'argent? On le voit dans l'accumulation des capitaux des grandes entreprises qui sont passés de 14 billions, donc 14 000 milliards de dollars à 28 000 milliards de dollars. Puis ça, cet argent-là, c'est pas taxé. C'est pas taxé. Si tu faisais juste taxer ça à 0,5 %, on serait capable d'aller chercher 140 milliards de dollars en revenus additionnels. Puis là, il faut juste imaginer ce qu'on pourrait financer avec ça, des mesures sur le climat qui seraient beaucoup bien meilleures que celles qu'on a présentement. On a un déficit de 14 milliards de dollars qui avait été promis par les libéraux puis qui n'a jamais été dépensé. On a appris ça cette semaine dans un rapport de Corporate Times. Puis pendant ce temps-là, le gouvernement continue à financer à hauteur de 18,6 milliards de dollars l'industrie fossile. Nous, on demande à ce que ce soit taxé. On veut que cet argent-là bénéficie aux Canadiens puis bénéficie aux générations futures. Malheureusement, avec les libéraux, on est habitué à voir bien du blabla, très peu d'actions, des grandes promesses qui ne se matérialisent pas. On espère que ce budget va être différent et c'est notre demande au gouvernement libéral pour le budget de demain. Mike?
Merci, Jonathan, et puis Elizabeth aussi. I'll just conclude with a few specific examples of what Greens have been calling for years and certainly in advance of Budget 2024. First, as you heard from Elizabeth, we must recognize that in this country, people with disabilities continue to disproportionately live in poverty. 40% of folks living in poverty are people with disabilities. This government has promised to hear the calls of folks with disabilities who've been calling for the Canada Disability Benefit, a federal income supplement that is meant to lift people with disabilities above the poverty line. We have been and will continue. We pushed for the legislation. We're now pushing for this government to actually fund the benefit, to put it in this year's budget coming out tomorrow, and to negotiate with provinces and territories in good faith to ensure they deliver it to Canadians with disabilities. Secondly, when it comes to the housing crisis that we are in, as Greens, we will continue to call for this government to truly address it head on by getting back into the business of building housing as a result of 30 years of both Conservative and Liberal governments that have turned away from investing in housing. Our social housing stock of deeply affordable housing is down to just 3.5%. Just over 650,000 units across the country. It's the bottom of the G7. As Greens, we're going to continue to call for this government to invest in doubling the social housing stock. It would still just put us at the middle of the pack in the G7. It's critical that we start to urgently get at this as one of the core root causes, as well as addressing the reality that large corporate landlords have turned our homes into commodities, and we need to reduce the incentives and eliminate incentives that have led to that being the case. And finally, as Greens, we will also continue to address where revenue tools could help pay for these significant investments. As you heard Jonathan earlier, where possibly could we find the funds? Well, let's start with the fossil fuel industry that is gouging Canadians at the pumps. Last year alone, in 2022 in fact, they raised their profits from 24 or so cents a liter to 42 cents a liter. It's an increase of 18 cents a liter. It's part of how they led to profits of $38 billion, the largest five oil and gas companies operating in Canada alone. As Greens, we've put forward that we should end subsidizing the very industry most responsible for the crisis we're in, and instead apply the Canada Recovery Dividend, a windfall profit tax, which this government has already done when it comes to banks and life insurance companies in the pandemic. They should do so and apply it to big oil. If they did, it would generate $4.2 billion a year, all of which could be reinvested back into making life more affordable for Canadians in the ways you've heard Elizabeth, myself, and Jonathan describe. With that, I'll turn back to Elizabeth for any questions. Merci encore.
Pardonnez-moi, j'ai seulement un autre enjeu pour rajouter. Parce que je pense que plus que jamais, le Canada doit investir dans le monde entier pour la paix et pour l'élimination de pauvreté. We talk a lot about our NATO target. Well, we have a target that's been there since Lester B. Pearson to eliminate global poverty with a goal of 0.7% of GDP to overseas development assistance. Maintenant, notre aide au développement à l'étranger est tellement petit. Il était coupé l'année passée dans le budget de 2023. We're calling for a doubling of overseas development assistance. This is part of getting a stable world, protecting democracies, and achieving that fairness that we talk about desperately needed for Canada globally. We have to invest in peace, and we have to invest in international development assistance. And I've been thinking about it a lot because I know our Conservative colleagues are pledging to eliminate overseas development assistance. I want to make sure Canadians talk about it, think about it. Where are our priorities for the world and for our children? And the other day when I was speaking of Brian Mulroney's record as former Prime Minister, that was the height of Canada's commitment to overseas development assistance in eliminating poverty. I want to remind my Conservative colleagues of that as they plan to go to zero, that we are a long way from the targets that were set decades ago, and yet Canada is committed to achieving the end of global poverty by 2030 as one of the goals Canada signed on to in the Sustainable Development Goals. Et maintenant, avec ça, je termine mes petits commentaires, et s'il y a les autres questions, nous sommes ici disponibles en anglais ou en français, nous trois.
All right, we have no questions in the room, so we'll go to Zoom. Just a friendly reminder to people joining us on Zoom. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function. Ici, sur les gens qui nous joignent sur Zoom, si jamais vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée.
Just add again, the points have been made very, very well by Jonathan Pedneault. When you look at, and again by Mike Morrice, it's Mike's motion that we had costed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. What would happen if we applied the same kind of excess profit taxes that are being applied now to banks and insurance companies to big oil? Big oil in this country is in the driver's seat, remains in the driver's seat, despite pledges by the Liberals that they were going to be climate champions. Big oil is still calling the shots with billions of dollars wasted, $34 billion to be precise, on building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, plus billions wasted on a technology that is unproven and unlikely to work, of carbon capture and storage, and on and on. It's time to stop funding big oil. It's time to fund and live up to the pledges that we just made at COP28 to triple our investment in renewable energy and double energy efficiency. This would mean for Canadians a huge drop in their energy costs, and we need to link that affordability and climate action go together. They're not opposite goals. They go together. Et avec ça, merci beaucoup.
Juste un petit dernier mot aussi, puis un petit message rapide au gouvernement Trudeau. Là. Ce serait bien qu'on respecte un peu les champs de compétences des provinces et des municipalités. On a beaucoup d'enjeux présentement de juridiction à travers le pays. On fait face à une crise qui est nationale, mais c'est absolument important de voir un leadership de la part du premier ministre Trudeau et de son gouvernement qui respecte les compétences des provinces. C'est malheureusement quelque chose qu'on a vu dans le cadre des annonces récentes. Énormément de pilage sur les pieds des provinces et des municipalités. On a une fédération. Ce serait bien qu'on utilise les outils qui existent dans la fédération pour régler les enjeux qui affectent la vie de tous les Canadiens.